Welcome to Citizens Count. This is the show for voters who want to learn from each other and have a friendly conversation about government and how New Hampshire can be the best state in the nation. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about what bills are coming up in the legislature, how you can get involved, and what voters think are most important, not just legislators. I'm Anna Brown, and this is my co-host, Jackie Benson. Jackie, good day to you.
Good day to you.
Today we're going to be talking about the hot issues that are coming up in the legislature, chosen by you, the voters. So, Jackie, a lot of people watching may not have heard of Citizens Count. What's your elevator speech for us?
Sure. So Citizens Count is a nonprofit organization that is devoted to inspiring New Hampshire citizens to make a difference. And we are strictly nonpartisan. So we provide resources that make it easier for you to get informed and involved with government, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum.
That's awesome. So I think that most people in New Hampshire agree that voting is important. We had record high turnout in the 2018 elections, but how can New Hampshire citizens get involved beyond the ballot box?
Well, once voting is over, that's really when the business of government starts happening. So that's when all of the bills that are going to change state laws that actually will impact your life and your finances and what you're able to do and not do, all of that happens after the election. So being able to keep informed about that process, to know what bills are out there and how they might change policy in a way that really impacts you, and then what your options are for taking action on them. Because at every stage in the process of a bill becoming a law, to get back to kind of that, basics of how civics works, at every stage in that process there's an opportunity for you to have a say.
So basically, if we were watching the I'm Just a Bill civics announcement, it should have just people walking around in the background sharing their opinion.
It should totally have people walking around sharing their opinion. And they can do that in person by showing up to the public hearing on a bill. In New Hampshire, every single bill that gets submitted has a public hearing where anyone can walk in off the street and get up in front of a committee and tell them, this is what I think you should do with this bill. Then the bill will get a vote. It gets at least one vote in one branch of a legislature, the House or the Senate. And that's another opportunity for you to reach out to your legislators via email or a written letter or even a phone call, or inviting them out for coffee, because they're probably your neighbors, and telling them how you think they should vote on this bill and why.
And I can share, so I spend some time in Concord and I interact with legislators as part of my work with Citizens Count, and they definitely want to hear from people, and they express to me that they will get individual letters, that they'll count how many letters they get one way or another, or they'll be really compelled by certain arguments. So, a little background on who we are. I'm responsible for research and analysis at Citizens Count, so there are roughly 1,000 bills that go through, and that's really more than your average person can keep up with. So I read and try to summarize those to make them more understandable for you. And
yeah, because Anna Brown is not your average person. And I'm the content editor of Citizens Count. So on our website, in addition to having summaries of these 1,000 bills, we have coverage of 100 different issues. And within those issues, you'll find background articles that explain, how does minimum wage work in New Hampshire? What are our gun laws? What are some of the ways policies changed in the last few years? How might it change in the next few years coming up? And we also then have a section where all of Anna's bill summaries, these nice, easy to read ways to understand what these bills are really about, they show up right there in each issue. So you're able to go to the website, choose an issue, and find out everything that's going on. So I'm the one who just makes sure all that content is there and up to date and working. So I'm the issue tracker.
yeah, so let's say that someone's really interested in one of these issues or bills. What's the next step for them if they want to make their voice heard?
So first of all, I would encourage them to check out the website and find that issue on the site. And that way you'll be able to see which bills are there that are related to it. Once you find out which bill you're interested in, then what you're going to want to do is check its status. So we track these bills, any of them that are related to our issues. You'll be able to see that status right on our website. We update that every week right through the session. But you'll also find that information on the state's website, which is the New Hampshire General Court. And what you're looking for are things like, has a public hearing been scheduled for the bill? Has the committee issued a report? Because that's the next step in the process. The committee holds a hearing, then they issue a report which either recommends that the bill pass recommends that it doesn't pass. Maybe they think we should study it, take a look at it longer. They might amend it, they might change it. That happens a lot. So these bills have like an extended life, and keeping track of where they are tells you what your opportunity for intervention is, for getting in there and having your say. So I would say track the bills, and then we can talk a little bit more here about some of these points in the process and what opportunities you have to come in and make a difference.
Sure. So we've talked about you can show up to a public hearing. You can also contact a legislator directly at any time. We can go to our website, and if you click on elected officials, you can find everyone who represents you in your town. But also, let's talk a little bit about the Citizen Voices Initiative, which is something that Citizens Count does. So we want to make it extra easy for people to get informed about these bills and share their opinion. So we select what we believe are going to be the top issues in 2019, the top bills. We look at all the bill requests, and we do a survey. And then we select those bills to push out on our Facebook page, push out on our website, and gather public comments that we then deliver in person at public hearings. Jackie, can you talk a little more about that survey process?
I can. So out of these 1,000 bills, we unfortunately don't have the bandwidth to put all of them out there. And some of them, honestly, they're a little technical. They're maybe not something that you'd be that interested in weighing in on. So we have to narrow down the list. And we do that by reaching out to various different groups of people and asking them, what do you think the big issues are going to be for the coming year? We talked to a bunch of legislators, so the people that are actually going to be making these policies up in Concord. We talked to ordinary citizens. We talked to business leaders and community leaders, other nonprofit leaders, and we do our own analysis of the bills that we think are likely to have the biggest impact in the coming year. We take all of that feedback and put it together in order to develop this short list.
So I pulled out our short list for us to talk about some of these top issues, because we all know that legislators were talking about some things in the elections. Family and medical leave came up a lot. We know that Republicans were really in favor of education savings accounts. But those are not necessarily what we heard back from the public one way or another.
Yeah.
So let's talk some about the top issues. The first one that we know is going to be big, because it came up in the News inauguration address, and there are a lot of bills, is the school funding issue.
Yeah, and this is a really complex one. So a lot of people get intimidated by it, which I think can make them feel like uncertain about putting their opinion out there. But we really encourage you to jump in and say something, because in a nutshell, the debate is about how much of the money that goes to our schools should come from the state, as opposed to your local taxes that you're paying to your town. And of that money that comes from the state, how should it be divided up between different schools? Should towns where taxpayers have a harder time raising more local money because their property's just not worth as much as it is in other towns, and all of our local taxing is based on property tax, should those towns get more money from the state, or should it stay kind of more of a level playing field where every school gets the same amount of money per kid? So this is a really intense debate. There's even a potential lawsuit on the horizon. There are a lot of different proposals on the table right now for how to change this. But if you feel like you have a strong opinion on this issue of how you think schools should be funded, I would encourage you to come to the website and read up on the different policies that are being proposed, and also then reach out and talk to your representative and ask them, where do they stand on this issue? Are they interested in one proposal versus another? And let them know the gist of what you want, because some of these issues can be really intimidating. You don't have to have a law degree or have your head around the whole thing perfectly in order to feel confident that your opinion matters. So whether it's responding to one of our Citizen Voices questions on this issue, where we'll basically take your feedback and present it to Concord for you, or reaching out yourself, it's an important issue to weigh in on and not get just freaked out.
Sure.
It can be a little freaky,
I feel that school funding, if I really want to break it down for people, it comes down to a tension between how much you're paying in local property taxes and what sort of funding your school is getting from the state, from other towns, And so if we're looking at, for example, stabilization grants, it's a really fancy word, but basically it's extra funding that the state is providing to some schools that are losing students, but they're still going to have the same fixed costs. And if you look at towns like Berlin, they're looking at losing over $200,000 a year, which could be a few teachers in salary.
Yeah, and if there's potential that student population could come back up, if you had to let all these parts of your infrastructure go because your money went down, then you've got to build that back up again. It can be really complicated. But on there's counter arguments on the other side too.
Yeah.
That why, should these schools be getting money for students that they don't actually have?
Right. And also the question, should the state be funding education at all?
Yes.
Which right now the New Hampshire Constitution requires that the state provide funding, but a constitutional amendment could happen, although there's not one proposed this year.
Not this year, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye out to see what's going to happen. So big issue, school funding, and that was when it was really important to all the different groups that we asked about the big issues.
So
for
we saw that
2019.
across citizens, legislators, industry stakeholders, all the different.
Everyone pretty much agreed this was going to be a big one this year.
So kind of related to schools, another thing that has come up is whether local schools should be allowed to ban firearms on school grounds.
Yes.
And so you and I have researched this a little bit because it's actually a really tricky area of law. Technically, there's a federal law that says you have to have a license to carry a firearm to carry a gun on school grounds. But the federal government isn't really going around enforcing this. And so as it stands in New Hampshire, the state says local school districts and towns cannot regulate anything with firearms.
Exactly.
So if a school wants to actively ban all firearms, whether or not you're licensed on school grounds, right now you can't do that in New Hampshire, but legislators want to change that.
They do, and I think it's going to be one of the bigger and more important bills that we'll see going through this year. And I actually would expect that we'll see action on it fairly early in the legislative session. And the bill would allow schools and school districts to make their own call as to whether firearms are allowed on campus, and who would be allowed to carry, who wouldn't, or whether there would be a blanket ban on them altogether. I think it's going to be a really fierce debate, and this is another question that's included in our Citizen Voices campaign. We have a discussion that's been going on about that since earlier in this month. And we're keeping our eye out for that public hearing to come up because we've had hundreds of people who've given their opinion on this issue.
Right. And I think it's a little hard to say would Governor Sununu sign or veto. In one of the earlier debates for the 2018 elections, I remember he said it's a constitutional right. You should be allowed to carry your firearm anywhere. That includes schools. But on the other hand, this bill would just leave it up to local school districts. It wouldn't do it statewide. So I wonder if he could be persuaded by the local control argument.
I think that leaves some room for uncertainty in where he would go. It's also possible that even if he opposed it, the legislature might get enough support to push it through a veto.
So and we're talking, over 30 Republicans would have to come over to the Democratic side to override a veto. And that's assuming that every single Democrat got in line.
But again, that local control angle
It's
appeals to a lot of members of the Republican Party. So it's going to be an interesting debate to watch unfold, and one that a lot of people feel like they have a real stake in.
Yes. So another one that was big in the campaign for Democrats, and we definitely know Republicans are going to be against, is a minimum wage increase.
Yes.
So there are 3, possibly 4 proposals we're looking at. So can you just kind of run through the different ones that are there?
Yeah, so some of them are a little, one of them seems very simple. It's to just raise the minimum wage to $10 an hour across just very
And
simple.
that's it. No cost of living increases over time, just one-time raise.
Yep. There are others that are more complex. They call for very kind of graduated increases up to $10 an hour or $12 an hour, and then additional increases that are tied to some other index like the consumer price index, so that New Hampshire's minimum wage would keep gradually going up to match increases in the cost of living. There are bills, some of them that address how much the minimum wage for people who are tipped should be and changing that. There are proposals for creating a training wage for younger employees who are new at their jobs to encourage businesses to kind of give new workers who don't have as much experience an opportunity.
So that was Rep. Howard Moffett, and he's a Democrat from Canterbury. His bill includes a training wage, and so that's if you're under 18 for the first 3 months of employment, you could have $1 below the minimum wage, actually.
Yes, and there's another bill that we haven't seen text for yet from the Senate President, Donna Soucy. So there's, and that's obviously going to be a pretty big deal. If the Senate President is proposing the bill, she's got a lot of power to really make sure everybody's paying attention to that proposal and giving it a real hearing. So I think that if you are somebody who has an opinion on the minimum wage debate, this is going to be on the table this year.
Absolutely.
And there's a really good chance that one of these bills could end up passing. Like, again, We've got a Republican governor who has said he doesn't think New Hampshire's minimum wage should go over
Yeah.
the federal
He thinks it should.
minimum.
It's interesting because the way I've sort of heard him is
Yeah.
he's not against a minimum wage increase. He just really thinks it shouldn't be state. It should be the federal government.
That's what he said. So it'd be interesting to see if that nuance in his position comes
Right.
into play when, if one of these bills passes and lands on his table. But citizens who are interested in this issue should look at all the different proposals that are out there, because there's a lot of different options, and kind of pick the one that appeals to you, and that's the one that you could throw your support behind. And again, we've talked about some of the different ways that you can go about doing that. Or if you're against a minimum wage increase across the board, then there are several different bills that you've got to look at that could potentially make that happen, that you might want to be contacting your representatives to make sure they're hearing your voice.
Yep. And once again, public hearings during the day in Concord, but if you can't attend, you can contact your legislators directly or follow us on Facebook, sign up for our newsletter, go to our website, and we present opportunities and we'll deliver the comments for you. So another huge one that's come up, and I know that especially this was one that was popular with
Yes.
citizens, was marijuana legalization.
Yes, and we have seen this proposal for several years now,
Over and over.
over and over. And we've watched this pass in our neighboring states. So New Hampshire held a big study on this issue this summer. They looked into all different aspects of how a marijuana legalization law could be implemented in New Hampshire, what it might actually look like to tax it, regulate it, decide who's allowed to sell it, how much people can buy. All of that data has now fed into there's at least one, there's two proposals.
Two definitely on the table, and it's another thing where it's a complex enough issue, you might see parts of it popping up in other bills.
Exactly. So it's going to be interesting to see which of those ends up being the one that kind of comes forward, but with the Democrats in control of both branches of the legislature and they made this part of their party platform this year, which was a change from past years. Those are two factors that mean that this has a much stronger chance of passing than it has in the past.
Although I think it's interesting to point out, when I was surveying candidates, because that's part of my job is researching all the candidate issue positions, it doesn't break down perfectly Democrat-Republican lines. You'll see people in both Republicans who are favored, Democrats who are against. And particularly, a lot of times there's a nuanced opinion. Like a lot of representatives I know have said, I'd be in favor of legalization if there was a way to test someone who is driving while intoxicated, because there's not really a scientifically reliable test for marijuana intoxication while you're driving. So that's another one where I think maybe it could pass, but also Governor Sununu is definitely against it.
Again, yes.
Because it's so controversial, I think it might be hard to muster the votes to override his veto.
And at the same time, there's a lot of public support for this.
There is.
Legislators are going to be under a lot of pressure, because I think we've seen from the work that we do that this is a particularly potent issue for the people on the ground.
Yes.
And I think that they've been getting less and less patient with the legislature over the lack of action on it over the last few years.
Very true. We know that another kind of marijuana legalization, it is a drug issue. The opioid crisis is going on. But another thing that we've noticed is rather than just funding, I should say, for opioid addiction treatment programs, we're also seeing a movement towards funding for mental health programs.
Yes.
And it sometimes they go hand in hand, especially when you're looking at funding bills. But this in particular this year came out. And in our survey, I think that was another one, correct me if I'm wrong, it was legislators, it was citizens, it was other stakeholders. It was really across the board that this was key.
Yeah, a lot of people agreed that this is going to be a big issue this year, but what they weren't certain about is exactly what form it was going to take. And I don't think that we have seen that yet, too. We're waiting for the bill text to come out. One thing we know is on the table, because we have seen a bill for it, and Governor Sununu mentioned it in his inauguration address, is the issue of the state psychiatric unit.
Right.
So our secure psychiatric unit right now is part of the state prison, which means that people that are committed to need to be committed to a secure psychiatric facility.
They're ruled to be a danger to themselves or others,
Yep.
and the state hospital doesn't feel safe handling them.
And they haven't necessarily been convicted of a crime, but they're going to go to this unit in the state prison to be cared for, which raises all kinds of ethical and potentially legal issues. So the state for a long time has been wrangling with the dilemma of shouldering the cost of building a secure psychiatric facility that is not part of the state prison. And I think there's a greater appetite for getting that done this year than I've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, right after the election, Sununu was mentioning that, Senate President Donna Soucy was mentioning that, and I think they are a little wary of a lawsuit as well.
Yes, because that's definitely a possibility.
All right, those are some of the big issues. There are like 20 that we identified that were really hot, so definitely be following us on Facebook, signing up for our newsletter, going to our website. And Jackie, I guess if you had to pick one other issue that just like personally interests, that you think is interesting that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet, what would it be?
Well, as a policy nerd, the question of redistricting is really interesting to me.
Yes.
So the 2020 census will mean that New Hampshire will be engaging in another round of deciding how its voting districts should be drawn in the not too distant future. Right now, the power to decide how those districts lay out lies with our state legislature. So that means that whoever's in power when the bell rings to draw the districts is going to be able to kind of control how they're laid out. And there's potential for whoever that is to draw the districts
them in their
a way
favor,
that,
you
yes,
know.
maybe benefits their party a little bit. Now, there's been a big argument to take that power away from the legislature and instead put it in the hands of an independent commission of people who would have certain guidelines that they are supposed to use when they're drawing these districts, like keeping town boundaries intact as much as possible, and using more mathematical formulas rather than their own judgment about how these districts should be shaped. So we've seen this come up several times in the past, but the bills didn't get a lot of attention. But it's back on the table this year, and the reason I think that it might get a little bit more, get a little bit further along has to do with the race for Secretary of State. Because the character who decided to challenge New Hampshire icon Bill Gardner for the position of Secretary of State is Colin Van Ostern, and he is a former candidate for governor and a former executive counselor. And redistricting is one of the issues that he made a big part of his platform. And he really felt that that independent commission was the right way for New Hampshire to go. So I'm very interested to see if that issue gets a little further along. I don't know that I would necessarily think it's going to pass this year.
Sure.
But I will be interested to see the debate get a little more real, because I think it was kind of more quickly
and also
in the
2020
House.
is coming up, so that's
It's
the
right
next
there.
census. So
Yes.
that's when the I think it's easy for us to forget about redistricting because it only happens once every 10 years.
But it can have a real impact on how much your vote really counts.
Very true. Very true. As we mentioned, you can visit our website to learn more about any of these issues. And there are multiple opportunities to share your opinion on these bills. You can attend bill hearings in Concord. You can contact your legislators who you can find on our website. You can go on our Facebook page, participate in our Citizen Voices program. And before we conclude the show, we want to have another opportunity to have more voter participation. So we accept questions. And so we have 2 questions that we're going to answer today.
Yes.
So, actually, you can ask me.
All right, I'll ask you. All right, so I understand the New Hampshire legislature considers a large number of bills each year, asks Greg from Hampton. How does Citizens Count help me make sense of this information? Do you rank the significance of each bill? And if so, how do you determine which bills are most important?
So that's a great question, because with 1,000 bills, I think even legislators have trouble really deciding what to focus on and figuring out how to vote on some of these issues. So as I said, as Director of Research Analysis, one thing I have to do is go through all 1,000 bills, read them, make readable summaries, and then we categorize them on our website, and we'll put them on key issue pages. So death penalty, there is a death penalty repeal bill. The
there
text
is.
for it came out just recently. Marijuana legalization, like we talked about. Should there be work requirement for Medicaid recipients? And so you can find the bills that way. In terms of ranking their importance, that's really up to a voter. But like I said earlier, and we discussed, we did that survey of legislators, citizens, members of Citizens Count, other stakeholders, and asked them what they thought the most important issues were. And those are highlighted in articles on our Citizen Voices campaign.
They are, but otherwise it's important for Citizens Count not to take a particular stand on any
Very
of these
true.
issues. You know, we're not going to tell you that one bill is necessarily objectively more important than another, because for each individual citizen, that answer is going to be different. And
Absolutely.
our job is just to make sure that information on all of these bills is there, so that whatever it is that inspires you to get involved in policy, you have the information that you need in order to do it.
Yeah, and actually that was another thing we talked about when we were choosing which bills to focus on in terms of really raising public awareness and gathering comments. We asked each other, is it important that the bill is likely to pass? Because, for example, if there's a right-to-work bill, we know that that's really probably not going to pass in a Democrat-controlled House and Senate.
It would be a long shot this year.
It would be a long shot. So we discussed, is it still worth including? And what we decided was, you know what? If a lot of our members, stakeholders, and legislators say that they're invested in this issue, then it doesn't matter if it's going to pass or not. We're still going to talk about it, educate people, and give that opportunity.
Because even if a bill doesn't pass in a given year, a lot of these legislators are back. I mean, they're all back
Absolutely.
next year, and a lot of them are back the year after that.
Yep.
You know, we have a lot of repeat members of our legislature. So the debate and discussion that happens around a bill, even one that fails, still helps to shape how they're going to make decisions about it in the future.
Absolutely. All right, so I will ask the next question of you. So this is a question from Joe from New Durham, and he says, how can I trust that you are nonpartisan and your interpretation of the bills is not slanted?
So it's a great question, because the issue of bias is a really tough one to tackle. You know, my background's in anthropology, so I'm very aware of how easily we can kind of bury our own awareness of where our
Right,
bias
not even
comes from.
realize that, you know, we're using certain words or...
So that's why
Yeah.
we try to make sure, so our staff personally come from across the political spectrum. We have members that are conservative, members that are more libertarian, members that are more liberal, and we try to make sure that we get multiple eyeballs on everything that we do. You know, all of our issue write-ups are reviewed, the bill summaries, we have other people that are looking at those and just making sure everything seems very fair and balanced. The way that we phrase these questions we ask about the bills, the whole team of people that review those to try and identify any way that write-up, you know, that the writer completely unconsciously might have
Right.
slanted the issue one way or the other. So we do everything we can to really try to make sure that we are as fair and balanced and unbiased as possible.
Yeah, I would say it's kind of really a cultural part of our organization.
Yeah.
And we kind of have fun challenging each other and saying, oh, well, did you think about this? What about this on the other side? I think that there's part of a lot of us that also enjoys that friendly debate, because it feels
Yeah.
like a lot of times you can't talk about these issues without people just really getting their hackles up. But where we're at, we just want to have that open conversation.
And we all enjoy playing devil's advocate
We
with each other
do.
as well. So.
We do. And I would say we also are always welcome for feedback from the public.
Absolutely.
So we get feedback from
Absolutely.
legislators, members, people, and so it happens sometimes that we phrase an issue a certain way and they say, you know what, you guys got to check yourselves and phrase it differently. I remember one recently, a few years ago actually, was we were talking about wind power,
Yes.
and someone pointed out, well, when you say wind farms, that has a very sort of agrarian, friendly connotation to it, and some people wouldn't feel that, so now we say wind power, because that's what it is.
Yep. Yep. And we figure if we're getting that feedback equally from both sides,
Yes.
then we're doing all right.
Yes, that's the goal. If you have a question you'd like to ask, email us. Our email is info@citizenscount.org. You can also find all of our contact information at citizenscount.org. Phone number, snail mail, we'll take anything. So that's it for this month's show. Next month, we're going to update you on where these hot issues are in the legislature, and also the budget will be starting up. When does the governor introduce his budget?
That would be February 1st, I believe.
All right. Thank you so much for watching. If you support our mission of trying to make it easier for citizens to get engaged and have civil conversations about the issue, please consider a tax-deductible donation. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we accept anything from $1 on up.